If you were to poll the average beekeeper, me included, and you asked what's the most remarkable honeybee in the colony, remember you've only got 3 choices, queens, drones, and workers, you probably get the answer back that queens are just the most amazing bee. They lay all the eggs, they're the mother of everyone in the nest, they've got this complicated mating behavior. Fantastic, that's true. If you were to ask beekeepers what's the least cool or important bee in the nest, they would always default to drones. Workers are just kind of those blah, blah, blah bees. There are so many of them in the nest, no one seems to care. But I submit to you, of the 3 bees in the honeybee colony, worker honeybees are by far the most remarkable honeybee. It's not really even close. Why do I feel that way? Well, let's just start a little bit about bee genetics. We all know that honeybees have a haplodiploid sex determinant system. Haploid, diploid, sex determinant system. That means sexes are determined based on whether the egg is haploid or diploid. If it's diploid, meaning the egg was fertilized, it has both a mother and a father, it becomes female. If it's haploid, meaning it wasn't fertilized, it only has a mother, it becomes male. Unfertilized eggs are males, males are drones. We'll toss that aside. The female egg, the fertilized egg, the diploid egg, on the other hand, is crazy. It's just remarkable what this thing is. That egg contains the potential either to be a queen or a worker, and it has nothing to do with the genes that it's been allocated. Workers and queens have the same genes. It only matters what the larva that comes out of that egg is fed while she's developing. I'm overgeneralizing here, but a lot of high quality food pushes that larva to become a queen. Less low-quality food pushes that larva to become a worker. But in theory, a worker could have been a queen could have been a worker. Frankly, the female honeybee is one of the most remarkable organisms on the planet. But I'm going to differentiate queens and workers, and this talk is not about the crazy things that queen does. I appreciate queens, but it's really about the crazy things that workers do. And even though a worker could have been a queen and a queen could have been a worker, when that female becomes a worker, it becomes, to me, the most remarkable honeybee in the nest. And why is that the case? Well, it's the case because worker honeybees do everything except fertilized eggs and lay eggs in the nest. Queens lay eggs, drones provided the semen, that's their purpose. But workers build the wax. Workers feed the young. Workers groom the queens. Workers remove the diseases and the pests. Workers take out the dead. Workers collect pollen and make bee bread. They collect nectar and make honey. They collect water and thermoregulate the nest. When it's cold outside, they warm the nest. Workers engage in this litany and this suite of behaviors. In fact, workers are the most behaviorally diverse of all the honeybees. They are remarkable, and I hope to convince you of such with this presentation. So how I'm going to deal with this is I'm going to talk briefly about the overall structure of worker bee behaviors, and then I'm going to walk you through each of those worker bee behaviors and how they occur and what they are. So first things first, the overall structure. Worker honeybees are not born into a task in which they remain their whole life. Instead, they're born into a task, and as they age, they move from task to task to task. We call this temporal polyethism. Temporal, time, poly, many, ethos, ethology, the study of behavior. So timed, many behaviors. Beekeepers call this age-related division of labor. So when a worker bee is born, as she ages, she goes through a fairly predictable series of behaviors. Now I say fairly predictable because their behavior is very plastic. It responds to the needs of the nest, which means if bees are doing things that are what old bees do, but there's a great need all of a sudden for things that young bees do, some worker bees can revert and do those behaviors. Some young bees can jump and do old bee behaviors. Some worker bees might toggle back and forth between a couple of behaviors before they move on. But in general, as they age, they progress through quasi-predictable tasks. There are things that newly emerged bees do that usually only newly emerged bees do. There are things that middle-aged bees do that usually only middle-aged bees do, and there are things that old bees do that usually old bees are the only ones who do it, even though you can get a little bit of that plasticity making the workers fill in the gaps. Furthermore, not all workers do all the tasks that all workers are capable of doing. Even though that progression is somewhat predictable, that doesn't mean they always do it. And as beekeepers, I remember when I was a young beekeeper, as beekeepers, we read the books, we think about this, we go, gosh, it's so predictable, we know exactly what workers are going to do. And furthermore, we'll take that task and we'll narrow it down and we'll say, this age bee is the bee that does it, she's the only one who does it. When in reality, if you take a bee out of a task and look at its age, it can be quite a broad age of bee performing that task. So, I gave you that prelude to share that what follows is the series of tasks that worker bees tend to follow as they age, but I'm also going to give you the entire age range and tell you the average age of the bee performing that task. You need to keep in mind that these are behavioral plastic tasks. They can go forward and come back. The age range may be bigger or smaller, your time of year, your stock of bees. But in general, I'll walk you through the typical age progression of tasks that worker bees do, and I'll finish this presentation talking about things that worker bees do that are kind of outside of age. In other words, it's not in that predictable lineage that bees will progress through as they age. So join me as we dive into the first of those tasks that worker honeybees perform. Now let's take a closer look at those worker honeybee tasks. The first task that worker honeybees typically perform when they emerge from their cell is cell preparation. They're usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 16 days old, being a mean of about 8 days. This includes two subcategories, that's polishing cells and cleaning cells, and in both cases, they are readying the cell for use. Polishing is the first task that they'll do, and cell cleaning will happen later in life, so we'll visit that in a moment. But in polishing, the worker bee will work from the back of the cell to the front of the cell, removing anything that's left over from all the previous cell occupants. This can be pupal cocoons, excretia, etc. And they'll also patch the walls of the cell with wax. When worker bees are 3 to 10 days old, about an average of 8 days, they will begin capping cells. So even though their wax glands are not yet fully developed, these young workers can secrete wax in small amounts. This allows them to cap honey and brood cells. And when they're capping honey and brood cells, it can take 20 minutes up to 6 hours to perform this task, so it can take quite a while. As bees age, they progress to feeding larvae. And this happens when worker bees are typically 3 to 15 days old for an average of about 10 days. These workers are the ones that are typically called nurse bees. So once worker bees have consumed enough pollen, her hypopharyngeal mandibular glands will develop, enabling her to produce brood food. So these young workers, when they come out of their cells, they will begin eating pollen. This helps develop those food-producing glands in their head, and then they will be able to produce that food they feed to the young, making them nurse bees. They decide what and when to feed larvae based on the age of the larvae and the type of larvae it is. And what's interesting about this is a single developing larva's cell may be visited 5,000 plus times by nurse bees, with those nurse bees feeding those developing larvae 1,000 to 2,000 times while those cells are uncapped. As worker honeybees age, they might engage in queen tending behavior. These are workers that are about 3 to 14 days old for a mean of about 11 days. And this is the task where worker bees can be found pointing at the queen in the circle around the queen, licking the queen, feeding the queen, taking her pheromones off of her body by licking and passing them to others. They may do this for 20 to 30 minutes. It's basically the queen's direct attendants. Sometimes this is called a retinue of workers, these workers that are around the queen, all looking at the queen, licking her and feeding her. The next task in which worker honeybees will find themselves engaged is honey production. And these worker bees are usually 10 to 20 days old for a mean of about 13 days. Now, these bees aren't really the ones that go collect the nectar to make the honey. Instead, these are the ones who meet the nectar foragers just inside the nest entrance. They will offload that nectar from those nectar foragers, and they will take that nectar and deposit it into cells. They will initiate the process of converting that nectar to honey by blowing nectar bubbles. They'll blow a bubble, suck it in, blow a bubble, suck it in. And all of this starts the dehydration process. They'll add enzymes into that nectar, and then they'll deposit it into the cell. They may perform this nectar blowing behavior, this nectar bubbles, for about 20 minutes or so before depositing it into the cell. Next, you get a cohort of workers whose responsibility it is to clean the debris in the nest. These workers are usually 11 to 15 days old for a mean of about 14 days. These are the ones who remove spoiled pollen, wax, dead brood, dead adult bees. They're often referred to as undertaker bees, and these are also the ones that engage in hygienic behavior, where they can detect diseased, parasitized, sick, or dead brood, even undercapped brood cells, remove that capping, and abort the developing individual that is diseased, sick, or dead. Next, you will get the workers that engage in pollen handling behavior. These are about 10 to 19 days old for a mean of about 15 days. Just like there's a cohort of workers who unload the nectar foragers at the nest entrance and then process it further, there is a cohort of workers who process the pollen foragers. But unlike those who offload the nectar foragers, these pollen handling workers don't take the pollen from the pollen foragers and put it in the cell. Instead, the pollen foragers will go and deposit the pollen from their hind legs directly into cells, and then the pollen handling bees will show up. They show up at those cells, they mix a little bit of nectar into that pollen, they pack that pollen into the cells, and they begin the pollen's conversion into what we call bee bread. Those bees, again, are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 19 days old for an average of about 15 days old. Next, worker bees may be engaged in comb building behavior. These workers are 12 to 23 days old for a mean of about 16 days. Usually around 12 days to 2 weeks after they emerge as adults, the workers' wax-producing glands have fully developed. So at this point, they are able to produce those scales of wax. Underneath their abdomen, they will take those scales of wax, chew them, manipulate them with their mandibles to create the new comb that we see in the nest, repair comb, as well as cap cells in the nest. From there, worker bees move into cell cleaning behavior. This is the second time that they engage in this behavior. These workers tend to be 11 to 25 days old for a mean of about 13 days. They will use their mandibles to restore cells, smooth cells, remove cell cappings, and prepare the cell for future use. Cleaning a single cell can take around 30 minutes, so it may take 5 to 30 workers or more to engage in readying a cell for reuse. The next task that many workers find themselves doing is ventilating the nest. These workers are 2 to 25 days old for a mean of about 19 days. This task is done outside the hive at the nest entrance, either facing the nest entrance or facing away from the nest entrance, fanning their wings. And depending on what direction they're facing, they're pushing air into the nest or pushing air out of the nest. And this will cool the nest, evaporate honey, it will reduce carbon dioxide levels in the nest, etc. You can see hundreds of worker bees performing this task, especially in the summertime. These bees have a very characteristic stance. You'll see their legs on the ground with their abdomens up in the air and their wings fanning actively. The next task that worker bees might do would be hive guarding. Those are workers who are about 15 to 28 days old for a mean of 19 days. These bees also have a very characteristic stance. They keep their four back legs, so their hind legs and their middle legs, on the ground and raise their front pair of legs, their forelegs, in the air. So you'll see these bees standing at the nest entrance with their front legs in the air with their mandibles open, and these bees will antenate incoming bees, bees that are coming into the nest. They'll antenate them and determine if they are a bee that belongs to that nest or an invading bee. And based on their determination of that, they may attack the bee or allow the bee to move into the nest. These are often the first line of defense that you will see at the nest entrance. These are often the bees that will come out after you if you have agitated a colony. Next, you get orientation flights. Worker bees that have reached this age are moving from tasks that occur inside the nest or at the nest entrance to tasks that occur outside of the nest. And in order to do that, they have to know where their nest is. So around 17 to 27 days of age, for a mean of about 23 days, worker bees will begin this orientation behavior. They take short flights in front of and away from the hive, putting their hive in the general landscape, learning where their hive is next to a tree or whatever, and they're using this to say, here is my hive, here is what it's near. Those orientation flights typically get longer and longer over time, and once they learn where their hive is in context with the landscape, they move to the task that typically is the one in which they die, which is foraging behavior. Foraging bees are typically 18 to 28 days or more old, for a mean of about 24 days old. These are the last tasks that workers will perform. When a worker bee leaves the nest for foraging purposes, they will collect nectar to convert to honey. They will collect pollen for bee bread purposes. They may be collecting water for thermoregulation, or plant saps and rosins for the purpose of making propolis. On average, a forager will live about 4 to 5 days and fly 500 or more miles before dying. These are the ones who also can dance. They have this complicated dance language that they can use to tell their sisters where the forage resources are. If you've listened to me going through this assortment of tasks, you'll notice the broad range of workers' ages that are engaging in this task and the overlap of a lot of these tasks, even the mean age of the worker bees performing these tasks. Nevertheless, these are the ones that kind of occur as a typical progression as their age, and there are other assorted tasks that workers can do that may occur in spite of aging. So for example, worker bees that are engaged in bearding behavior, those clusters on the face of the hive in the summertime. Worker bees can also thermoregulate. They can heat the nest when it's cold, cool the nest when it's warm. Worker bees can even lay eggs. In the absence of a queen, some of the workers in the nest ovaries can develop, and those worker bees become laying workers and they'll lay eggs, but workers cannot mate, therefore their eggs are unfertilized. And so any colony led by a laying worker is doomed because workers will produce unfertilized eggs that result in drones. Worker bees can also patrol, looking for tasks to be done. They don't always have something to do, so they will walk around trying to figure out what needs to be done next. Worker bees will engage in defensive responses. When you're opening a nest, often more worker bees will come at you than just the guard bees, so they're capable of defending the nest and stinging. Worker bees will also engage in robbing behavior, where they're trying to take resources from other colonies. They may groom themselves, where they're removing mites or dust particles. They may groom one another. They may engage in trophallaxis, where they receive food from other workers or pass food to other workers. They dance to communicate resources. They might engage in swarming behavior. So there's this whole cascade of behaviors that worker bees can find themselves engaged in. But what's most remarkable about workers is we give them the name worker bee. We've got phrases like as busy as a bee. But believe it or not, the behavior that worker bees perform most is actually resting. If we called worker bees what they do most, we'd call them rester bees because they spend a lot of time resting between this group of tasks that can find themselves performing. Hopefully by now that I've gone through this entire presentation and told you all the remarkable things that worker bees do, you will have a new appreciation for how ridiculous these bees are. Queens are cool, drones are not so bad after all, but workers are really the most remarkable honeybee in the honeybee colony. And I think you will agree, in the very least, what they are capable of doing on behalf of the nest is really truly amazing. So the next time you open that hive, take a look in the nest, and you see all those common worker bees, just think about what they do to make that nest, that colony living in it, thrive and move forward with purpose.